There was a time when Europe forgot how to dream. Buildings were gray, ideas were borrowed. Books were locked away from the people who needed them most. And then, something shifted. Like someone waking up and realizing the world had color again. That's what the Renaissance was. Suddenly, monks were copying Plato while painters were sketching muscles like they were sacred. Kids named Leonardo were building flying machines out of daydreams. And Florence? Florence was acting like the center of the damned universe. And maybe it was, for a minute. This was a creative uprising. A rebellion with paint, poetry, and perspective. A revolution where the weapon was thought, and the battlefield was the human mind. But the question is, how did it all begin? Let's go back to the spark that lit the fire. It all began in 1400, in a place where people had money. Yes, but more than that, they had hunger. Hunger for ideas, beauty, and for something beyond survival. To understand what sparked the Renaissance, we have to rewind a bit. Europe had just crawled through some of its darkest chapters. The Black Death had torn across the continent. Nearly half the population was gone. Cities were emptied, faith was shaken. Life felt fragile, like something borrowed. And for a while, surviving was the only ambition. But once the dust settled, once people could breathe again, something strange started to happen. There was a sense that maybe life could be more than work and waiting for the afterlife. Maybe it could be understood. That curiosity found its heartbeat in Italy, especially in a city called Florence. Florence, because it was wealthy, thanks to the booming wool and banking industries. But more than that, it was connected to trade routes, other cultures, and to new ideas moving in and out like waves. Besides, it had something rare. Powerful families were willing to spend money on more than gold and land. One of those families was the Medici. They made their fortune in banking, but their legacy would be built on something else entirely: patronage. That means they paid thinkers, artists, architects, and scholars to think bigger. They sponsored libraries to preserve ancient texts that had been buried and forgotten since the Roman Empire collapsed. They also brought in teachers to translate works by Plato and Aristotle, philosophers from over 1,000 years ago. This gave people access to ideas that had been lost for centuries. And while all of that was happening in the world of thought, something else was taking shape. A new kind of art. Artists started studying the human body. They drew it, sculpted it, and celebrated it. They learned how to paint emotion and perspective. It sounds simple now, sure, but back then, it was revolutionary. For the first time, paintings had depth, faces had feelings, and walls became windows into entire worlds. At the same time, engineers and architects began solving problems that had baffled builders for generations. It was when a man named Filippo Brunelleschi figured out how to build a massive dome in Florence, a feat that hadn't been done since ancient times. His design changed how people saw possibility. All of these factors somehow contributed to one another. Books sparked ideas. Ideas inspired paintings. Paintings reshaped buildings, and buildings echoed the spirit of new thinking. A forgotten manuscript resurfaced. A wealthy patron gave a young sculptor a chance. A curious scientist looked at the stars and wondered, what if Earth wasn't at the center? The fire caught slowly, but once it did, it spread through Italy, across Europe, and eventually into the way we think, speak, write, and create today. That was the Renaissance, a turning point, and a single question started it all. What if we saw the world differently? And once that question was asked, there was no turning back. Every fire needed fuel, and for the Renaissance, that fuel was ideas. Big ones, bold ones, and the kind that poked holes in old beliefs and lit up new paths. At the center of this intellectual shift were the humanists. No, that doesn't mean they sat around singing Kumbaya. Humanists were scholars who believed something radical for their time, that humans, ordinary, flawed, brilliant humans, were worth studying and understanding. One of the earliest was Francesco Petrarch, born in 1304. He spent his life digging through ancient libraries and writing letters to dead Roman philosophers like Cicero as if they were old friends. Petrarch wanted to revive history by reading through it thoroughly. Then came Leonardo Bruni, who gave the Renaissance its name. He used the word rinascita, meaning rebirth, to describe this return to classical thinking. His aim was to pull the wisdom of the past into the present and reimagine what was possible. These thinkers started asking questions that hadn't been asked in centuries. What makes a good life? What does it mean to be free? Can we shape our destiny, or are we just pawns of fate? And for the first time in a long time, the answers didn't have to come from the church. Marsilio Ficini, a philosopher in Florence, translated Plato into Latin so others could read him. He believed the soul was divine and that philosophy could lead to love. Yes, love. Then came Pico della Mirandola, who at just 23 wrote a speech called Oration on the Dignity of Man. It has been called the Manifesto of the Renaissance. He argued that humans could rise or fall by their own choices. That idea shook the ground beneath centuries of doctrine. It led to the reprogramming of how people saw themselves. They stopped seeing themselves as helpless sinners crawling towards salvation, but as creators, capable of thought, change, and shaping the world with their own hands. And that shift would ripple outward into science, politics, literature, and beyond. For a while, the Renaissance lived and breathed in Italy, in the studios of Florence, the churches of Rome, and the libraries of Venice. But ideas don't stay put, especially not ones this electric. By the late 1400s, the spark had leapt beyond the Alps. It was carried by books, merchants, artists, and students. Soon it started to spread like rumor and wildfire across Europe. And wherever it landed, it adapted and evolved. It picked up new colors and new meaning. In the north, places like Flanders, Germany, and the Netherlands saw a Renaissance that looked a little different. The focus here was less on perfect anatomy and more on detail, painfully precise detail. Jan van Eyck, a renowned figure, for instance, could paint a single pearl so realistically you'd swear it had weight. And then there was Albrecht Dürer in Germany, a painter, printmaker, and low-key genius who blended Italian techniques with northern symbolism. He believed art could carry the same intellectual weight as philosophy or theology. That was new and certainly big. But if you're wondering who really lit the match for the Northern Renaissance, it was a guy named Johannes Gutenberg. Around 1440, he built something the world had never seen: a printing press with movable type. That meant books didn't have to be copied by hand anymore. Ideas could spread fast, they could multiply and explode. And they did. By the early 1500s, a scholar in Rotterdam named Erasmus started writing razor-sharp critiques of religion and society. His words were printed and passed across Europe. He believed in reform and reason, and in returning to original text instead of blind tradition. Then in England came Thomas More, with his bold idea of utopia, a fictional island that questioned how we govern, who we trust, and what we call civilized. And of course, there was Shakespeare. He wasn't technically a Renaissance scholar, but oh, was he steeped in its spirit. His plays were packed with humanism, psychology, politics, and poetry. They reflected a world that had started to think deeply about itself. So no, the Renaissance didn't stay in Italy. It traveled and transformed. It met new minds, asked new questions, left fingerprints on everything, from science and literature to politics and printing ink. The fire spread, and it never really went out. Maybe the Renaissance never ended. Sure, the paintings are framed in museums now, and the thinkers have long since turned to dust. But the questions, they're still here. We're still asking what makes life meaningful. We're still chasing beauty in chaos. Still building, sketching, writing, coding. In other words, searching for better ways to see. We carry pocket-sized libraries. We send machines to Mars. We argue about ethics, art, and identity, just like they did. And if we're still dreaming bigger, pulling forgotten ideas into the light, and believing that a single mind can reshape the world, then yes, we're still living in it. So maybe the Renaissance was a mirror, one that still reflects who we are and who we're becoming. We're surrounded by technology, but still aching for meaning, drenched in data, yet starving for wisdom. The names have changed, the tools have changed, but the fire, it's still flickering in all of us. And if that lit something in you, then stay close. We're just getting started. Thanks for joining us, and please hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell icon, because the past still has something to say, and this channel is where we explore every word of it. See you in the next story.